My name is Cantor Dan Singer. I'm here at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City on the Upper West Side. I am sitting together with Toby Singer, and we are not related. I just want to put that out up front. Not that we know of anyway. We have not established our family relationship at all, but we work in the same kind of environment. We work in synagogues. We work in music. I'm a cantor. Toby is a composer and the creator of The Match. And that's what we're here to talk about today, a new musical. And I want Toby to tell you about his new musical and just give us an idea of what this is. What is The Match, Toby?
So The Match is a new musical about the story of Jewish poet and paratrooper Hannah Senesh. It tells sort of the story of her life, but it also kind of engages with some other people in her story that are a little less familiar to broader audiences and also Jewish audiences as well. A lot of people that are somewhat Jewishly learned know Hannah, have heard of her, have heard of maybe like the bullet points of her story, of her poetry, of her diary potentially. But very few people have heard of this person named Rudolf Kaztner, who in the 1950s was accused of being a Nazi collaborator in the state of Israel. And when I sort of discovered his story in the larger context of Hannah's story, it suggested a really exciting theatrical representation of her story. And that was kind of the jumping off point.
Fabulous. We did a reading last week of your musical here in our social hall. It was extremely well received. We had many people come up afterwards who were very interested in what's the next steps. Could you tell us what inspired you to write a musical about Hannah Senesh and Rudolf Kaztner?
Yeah. So I have had the thought to write a show about Hannah for a very long time. It's one of these. I'm one of the kind of writer that is always working on maybe like 5 projects at once in various stages of completion. And I had in the back of my brain for quite a while, maybe a decade, that her story would make a really exciting musical. It's very dramatic. She's got this heroic arc to her, short but very intense life. And it really took until, honestly, 2017, when there were literal neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, that it kind of just jump-started for me the idea of really putting this story together and really just committing to actually writing it down. I had discovered, this sort of information about Rudolf Kaztner, this other person in her story, in that same time frame, and it all kind of came together. And that was when I decided to put it together in that way. Okay.
And tell us more about your creative process. How did you develop the storyline and the characters for The Match? How did you integrate Hannah Senesh with Rudolf Kaztner?
So the creative process, I would say, is sort of interesting. There were some song snippets that existed very early on that were actually, this is like inside baseball a little bit. They were snippets of songs for a project that never fully developed. It was just like, some ideas that I was bouncing around, and I found myself inspired by them and used them essentially as like the springboard to creating kind of the architecture of the show in its original draft. It's changed a lot over the last couple of years, to be clear. I explored a number of different conceits for telling her story. I was thinking about, because her story is so, she jumps out of a plane. There's all this stuff that she does. Would it be interesting to explore her story in kind of a linear fashion, or would it be interesting to explore it in some kind of more non-traditional way? And when I sort of encountered Rudolf Kaztner, and the reality that these two people never actually met in real life. These are people that existed on very parallel, very different life paths, and essentially intersect in this very specific and profound way. I don't know how much I want to get into it necessarily in an interview, since it kind of gives away the game. But the fact of the matter is that I can say certainly here is that they never met. And so for me, what eventually became really exciting was to make a story built around a imagined meeting between them. These two people that explored essentially the pursuit of justice in two very different ways. Hannah, essentially this almost like a traditional heroic figure, she puts herself at risk, puts her life at risk, and eventually, in fact, sacrifices herself essentially for the pursuit of justice. And then you have this other person, Rudolf Kaztner, who essentially finds himself having to negotiate directly with Adolf Eichmann and the Third Reich in Hungary, in Budapest during the war. And so it's this sort of tension between almost like pragmatism and idealism, two different approaches, both valid and both messy. And that's what I really like about their stories, is that you can't really say that either one did it perfectly right. No, nobody is perfect. And it is interesting to look at sort of today, looking back, how we kind of examine this heroic figure who did, who had her ideals, but this other person saved 1,600 people. Essentially, he was another, I don't want to say he was another Schindler, but he was somebody in that same ilk of somebody who managed to, in the midst of horror, save a lot of people's lives. And the difference is, unlike a lot of these other people that were saving people's lives in this way, is that he was Jewish. So in a certain sense, I don't love this expression, righteous Gentile. I don't love it. But in a sense, he was a righteous Gentile who was also a Jew, which is, it maybe reflects a little bit on how he was treated after the war. Was he black and white? No, he was sitting in the gray. Did he really give a character reference at Nuremberg to a Nazi officer? Yes. It's messy. Did he also save people? Yes. And so that to me was a very exciting theatrical structure to explore. And I would say that all of the music sort of sprang from that realization that I could build a story around this imagined meeting.
So tell me more about your process for research and how you put together, how did you gather information about Hannah Senesh and Rudolf Kaztner in order to create the historical context for the period and create a believable narrative?
Sure. So it's important to say up front that the match is historical fiction. It is, I think, important to just state that. And in a certain sense, it should be clear. These are two people that never met. This is a imagined meeting, and it's not really giving away this story too much. Hannah is dead. She's a ghost. It's a ghost story. So in a certain sense, the historical fictional part of this informs a lot of the actual record that I do have in the story. In terms of how I did my research, there was a number of books that I read, both about Rudolf and Hannah as well. I studied Hannah's diary itself pretty in depth. I found that to be very exciting, because the thing about Hannah in her diary is that she really comes off as this just sort of gentle, beautiful soul, but also really angsty. She's like an angsty early 20s person, and, is really struggling to figure out what the heck she's doing with her life. And, these are things that I think are somewhat universal in how, I remember being like that in my early 20s. Frankly, I remember being like that in my 30s. This is not like stuff that is necessarily a unique experience to one person. So it was a lot of books. It was the diaries. There were some interviews that I found, some articles that I found that was very interesting. And I used that information to sort of inform the larger story. I think that where I used a little more license was in creating essentially the sort of secondary story that underpins this imagined meeting between Hannah and Rudolf, which was a story about Moroccan Jews that were emigrating or that were coming to Israel in this time period from basically post-war into throughout the 50s. And there are folks that came over in different ways. There are folks that came over, I'll use somewhat scare quotes, legally. And there are people that came over, essentially under cover of night in boats. And I thought that it was a really interesting dichotomy to explore between the story of this guy, this lawyer, Rudolf, who during the war is essentially smuggling people out of Germany before the Nazis invade Hungary in the middle of the war. And it was interesting to sort of juxtapose that experience of him in war with the secondary story of these two recent immigrants to the state of Israel who are having different experiences of that. And playing off of that, where Hannah and Rudolph are having this dialogue, this essentially intense dialogue that they never got to have. And then in the back room, in the kitchen, these two other characters are having their own sort of parallel, but also linking story that gets developed and then also kind of intersects with what Hannah and Rudolph are talking about. Now, those people are not based in any specific person. These are creations of my brain, but they're based in the larger context of the types of folks that were coming over during this time period and the experiences that they had.
And what challenges have you experienced in terms of setting all of this into a musical format?
That's a really interesting question. I was going to say there are only challenges in creating a musical. But, I think where it was a challenge for me was in learning how to link these themes together of the story and sort of transpose, no pun intended, transpose them into musical language in ways that it would take an audience along for this narrative ride. That's sort of like strange language to say that essentially like I wanted to tell the story as a narrative, but I also wanted to tell that story musically. I didn't want this show to necessarily just be like song about a thing, song about a thing, song about a thing. Not that there's anything wrong. There are plenty of shows that's a perfectly suitable structure for. But for me in this show, it felt important to, I don't want to call them like leitmotifs or anything like that, but essentially to use certain themes that are attached to certain characters, to certain ideals, to certain concepts, and weave those through the music. So it's not as much of a challenge as much as that was my task. And it took a while to sort of like find the right balance of how to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I would love to know more about, since you wrote the book and the lyrics and all of the drama that's in it, as well as composing. Is this your first time doing that, or is this have you done this before?
Where I do the whole thing?
Like where you do the whole thing, or are you used to working with other teams of people, or?
So it's every collaboration is different. I will say that up front. There have been situations in the past where I work with somebody who's exclusively writing a book, somebody where I would say we have our fingers in everything collectively, just sort of working together. There's two other shows before this where I did the whole thing in a certain sense. But for me, I think this is the first time that doing it to like all by myself has felt a little bit more fully actualized, I would say.
Right.
Like I'm a musician first, I'm a composer first. And so in a certain sense, I've come to the art of theatricalizing things in this fashion sort of secondarily. And I love it.
That's great.
And it's something that, actually, I think arguably, if I had to say what the biggest challenge for me was, is that, and it continues to be. This show feels very personal. Partially, it's just the time period that this is taking place for me as I'm writing it. This has obviously been a challenging stretch of years for, I think, a lot of us. And I think writing something that is essentially about imbuing myself with the courage to stand up to encroaching darkness and hoping that it can inspire others to do the same is powerful stuff. And it's stuff that sits deeply inside, if that makes sense. So in a certain sense, it's not that I wrote this show as therapy, but I wrote this show and have found it to be therapeutic for it to exist, if that makes sense.
It's certainly, that's kind of the feedback that I've heard after the show from other people. So you're not alone in terms of what you thought. So getting into that more deeply, can you talk a little bit more about the music and lyrics for the match and how they might help to tell the story and develop the characters? You know, you've got a good number of songs in here. Budapest, things that stuck out to me. Friends with Nazis, certain songs like that. Can you talk more about the lyrics and the music and how it expresses the characters?
Yeah, well, I think one thing it's worth pointing out, in terms of first-person material, it's worth noting that I really don't engage with the direct text of anything that Hannah wrote. Rudolf did not have the same sort of output of written. I mean, he did some journalism. I think there are things that exist, but it was not as interesting to me. Like, for instance, I don't have the outright text of like, "Oh, walk to Caesarea," in here. I don't have like, "Blessed is the match." The name of the show, there's a reference to it, but I'm not like just plugging in these source materials. However, it is worth noting that I am inspired by them. There's a song, Ocean Song, which is essentially my imagining of that poem. I turned eventually, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the composer who said Ailey, Ailey. Yeah, it's Ailey, Ailey, yeah, that whole poem. So I essentially set it to music, except I didn't, not from the source material. It was more about the experience of her in this moment where she's in this kibbutz. She doesn't really know what she's doing. She doesn't really connect with people. And she's sort of given this opportunity to do something really nuts, if we're being honest. I think I personally am a little afraid of heights. So to me, this is like the height of insanity. No, maybe a pun intended. I don't know. It's fine. But the song is sort of a theatricalization of that experience of her writing this poem, even though it's not the poem, if that makes sense. And there are other moments like that as well. I think that a song like Friends with Nazis, for instance, when people say the word collaborator, I feel like that is weird. And I feel like people don't get it. Doesn't sound like what it is. Like someone says that person was a Nazi collaborator. I'm like, yes, they collaborated. But I think if you say they were friends with Nazis, it's like a lot more, frankly, punchy and a lot more like to what it actually was. Like this guy had dinner and drinks with these Nazi officers. Was it because he was forced to? Did he find himself drawn into this circle? The haze of history, the fog of war, we'll never really know. And that's kind of the messiness of Rudolf himself. But I think it was important for me to explore the language that shows some of this stuff really directly in a certain way. The Budapest thing is honestly more just a bit than I'm playing off of the fact that there are two cities like Buda and Pest. And definitively, I'm not pronouncing them the way that they should be pronounced. But to me, it was fun. It doesn't work if you say Budapest, Hungary. It doesn't work if you say Budapest. It's just, it's more of a bit than anything else.
But later on in the show, you ask who's a hero, right? Yeah. And I think that kind of hits the point to me. Is you're asking the question, who comes out of this as the hero? And so what do you feel is the most important message that you want the audience to come out with after seeing the match?
I think there are two things. I think one is that statement, who is evil, who's a hero, is a question. It's not an answer. It's just a question. And the show doesn't really answer it. And I think that that's important. I didn't want to make a grand statement that says like, Hannah Senesh, support the hagiography of her. I support the idea that she was a hero and a wonderfully sensitive artist who created works that lasted, which is rare. And then I think that it's important to note that like this other guy saved a bunch of people, and the descendants of the people that were on that train live today. And I think that sitting in that discomfort, frankly, is pretty Jewish. And sitting in that discomfort, I think, is really important also today when things can be very polarized in all sorts of areas of public life, of private life, online, offline. And I think being able to sit with sort of, it's not even conflicting views, but just like two things that can be both true and false at once. And that's why I left it as a question. That's why the language of that statement doesn't ever change. It's who is evil, who's a hero, give me strength to tell. So I think that that's one of the things that I wanted to take away. And then the other thing is kind of what I said earlier. I feel strongly that we all have it in ourselves to fight back against encroaching darkness. Now, can we all make a difference? We asked that question in the show too. Can we all make a difference that's tangible to the world? I don't know. I don't know if I always buy the idea that like we can like make a tangible difference that moves things forward. But can we do the things in our own lives and in our own communities, in our own vicinities, in our own circles that make things just a little bit better? I think so. And I think this is like a show that I hope can give people just a little more courage while we're watching, frankly, a world and a society that is spinning. We are spinning. There's a lot of spinning going on. It's a word that I've used in recent years. And I think being able to not be discouraged by that and not to withdraw, but rather to engage. If that's clear.
Yeah, very much so. Let's transition into the performance that we saw last Thursday, which I was very impressed. We pulled this all together, and it was a reading. It wasn't like a fully staged performance, but more to capture the musical itself and to be able to help you find someone to give this wings and produce it. So that's what I really enjoyed about being able to open our synagogue to do is to give birth to a wonderful musical about a female figure, especially during Women's History Month here on the first day of the month. It was really, really nice to do that. So let's talk about the casting and talk about the actors and actresses who portrayed these people, and what are the qualities that you looked for when you were selecting the cast for this performance. And do you see these same people continuing on when it gets developed?
I hope so. I would love to involve a bunch of them, honestly. I mean, the way that those things get built varies from project to project, so it's not something I necessarily have control, but like I get very attached to the people that I work with in, these various contexts over years. And I think that the casting itself kind of reflects that. There are people in this who have been doing readings of this show for a couple of years, who feel, I think, connected to the show in a meaningful way, which in turn feels very meaningful to me to continue to involve them as I work to try to evolve the piece. There are people that have come into it in more recent iterations, whether via recommendation or whether via, a lot of things are just done online now because this is all very like shoestring budget, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And I
we did it though.
We did it. No, I love it.
It was amazing.
I come from the world of cheap and dirty art, and I love finding ways to continue to do that sort of thing. And so for me, what was I looking for? I mean, I'm always looking to work with people that are kind and are empathetic. That's probably the number one characteristic of, frankly, just anybody I want to spend time with. And I don't think it's different in art making. I think, in fact, that it's important that it's sort of the types of folks that I want to work with are, in fact, sort of consistent with the types of people I just want to be around. And those are kind and empathetic souls, whether they're in the band or whether they're on stage with me.
What specific qualities did you want to see in Hannah and Rudolf, like in those actors that portray those characters,
Well, I mean, I think that what is interesting is I like not getting too tied down to a specific conception of what who Hannah is played by or who Rudolf is played by. Because I think that, and I've experienced this, is that I think part of the discovery and the development of any show, but certainly of this show, it would be included in that, is that discovery is more rich when you don't narrow yourself down to like, this is the only type of person that can play this type of role. And I think it's been very helpful to have, different people read these roles and to explore different nuances in the character and highlight things in different ways that then inform its continued drafting and development.
And you mentioned to me before that you had begun this prior to the pandemic. And it was supposed to have taken off. Can you talk a little bit more about the pandemic and its impact on the development of this show? Of
course, yeah. I mean, it certainly played a big part. It's funny. I was in grad school before the pandemic, and basically right up until the pandemic, as it were. And I was working on this piece when I was not doing grad school things. That balance didn't always work out, but that's fine. And I, like a lot of other composers and writers, and frankly, actors and musicians and artists of all types, there was sort of this, things just halted. Everybody halted in a sense. But for us, it was a lot of like, okay, well, all these things that I've been working on, we just need to pause. And I found that it let me have the space to really engage with what the show was needed to really be about. It gave me an opportunity to record some really exciting production demos over that summer of 2020, where a bunch of actors recorded themselves on like iPhones and in their own closets. Very few people had like real pro setups, but people were just like, I'm just going to record these tracks for you on my iPhone, and I'm going to send it to you, and we'll see what happens. And it was a very energizing experience to be able to like feel like I was creating something and building towards something, even in the middle of this period where things were just very much in this period of stasis. And I mean, I think that the experience of the pandemic really, I think it just drove me to want to see this thing blossom, because I mean, the messages are different. It's not like the pandemic itself was this encroaching darkness, that like viruses are not conscious creatures. Like, it's a terrible thing. And these terrible things have happened to humankind for as long as we've been around, right? But the things that happen within the context of that, I think there's a lot of power and value in creating art that can help energize and give people courage in the face of what is growing and creeping around the peripheries, and sometimes not so around the peripheries, as we've experienced over the last few years.
What are your musical influences in terms of, you have a very unique style, I think, of composition, and I believe you studied composition at University of Michigan, right? We're both Michigan grads. Go Blue.
Go Blue. No, I was a
Yeah.
classical voice. I was a classical voice major, and then I switched to music theory when I realized that I really wanted to be a writer, and that was where I
Right.
wanted to put my focus. I mean, musical influences, good Lord. I would say
Yeah.
I'm probably, I would almost call it like an unholy mix of a lot of classical music, a lot of indie rock, um, and I would say also jazz. I grew up, playing a lot of jazz piano, jazz trumpet. I grew up in lots of orchestras, both in school and like summer festivals. And um, so, I mean, I sometimes joke that I'm like equal parts like Tchaikovsky and like the Get Up Kids, which is like two weird bands. But I think that they sort of at play. I played in a bunch of bands in my 20s and 30s and have like, toured with groups and produced records. And so like I've been very steeped in sort of the world of like pop music and rock music and production. And then also, just like sitting playing Czech 5, fourth trumpet or seventh trumpet or whatever, in the back of a giant room or like at Hill Auditorium. We both went to Michigan, so we know about that. Or like, yeah, so it's, and then, yeah, so it's, and then the other part of that is also choral music. The experience of being in choirs, the experience of creating choral ensemble sounds is a really important part of the way that I write musical theater. I think that there's a lot of power in creating beautiful, dense, tensiony choral music that can fit into the context of a musical theater sound, as it were. It's not that I write like very like classical choral sounding stuff that would sit in a musical theater sound. It's using musical theater voices, using musical theater ranges, using the way that these types of implements can be, or these elements can be manipulated. But that's sort of my thing. I don't have sort of a one track musical background. I feel like I've just been blessed to just be around so much different stuff and get to play so much different stuff. And like, there's sort of part of me over, at times in my past, I'm like, oh, I'm more of a jack of all trades rather than like a master of any one of these specific things. But I think it feels very gratifying to be able to create music pulling from all of these different places and feel confident in being able to kind of put it across, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's try to dream together. What would you like to see happen with the match? Where would you like to see this go? Is there like a dream producer or kind of a theater, or where would you like to see this go?
I'm pretty sure my agent wouldn't like me to say any of that out loud, but
Right.
I will say that I'm hoping,
Without specifics.
No, it's okay. I understand. I would say what I'm hoping to see is it find a developmental home. I think that I want to find it, whether that's in a theater, whether that's in a summer festival, some place where it can really like get its footing, spread its wings, put it in a context where we can really like hone the book and hone its message and hone the way the story works as from a pacing perspective and a character perspective. I'm just very excited by the prospect of getting to it was like very exciting for these two presentations I did over the last couple of weeks, to see kind of where it has gotten to as a piece. And now I feel very motivated and excited to see what happens when we can kind of put it into that next stage where we get it up on a stage and we get it into some kind of workshopping context. But like, of course, I would love to see it show up at like a cool theater that thinks that a piece of, sort of forward-thinking progressive musical theater with a strong message, with a strong Jewish protagonist, two strong Jewish protagonists, arguably three. And I think that I want to find a home where that is viewed as an exciting part of the project, if that makes sense. So inherently, there will be other voices that I'm excited to find in the room as this show goes forward. This is true, again, of any, musical in particular in its process of development. Sure, there are producers and there are theaters that are collaborative in different ways, again, depending on sort of the context. But an important role that I haven't yet filled is sort of the longer term, like figuring out who is going to help craft this from a directorial and a dramaturgical standpoint is what I would say. It's something that, that's a person in the room that is going to have a lot of say in tone, in helping to shape the piece in ways that I can't see. Again, I'm speaking more generally because this is a part of the process, I think, for lots of shows. And then I would also say that if it came to, bringing somebody on whose specialty is more in the written word than in the musical word, I would be very excited to find, a collaborative partner who understands the sort of the potency of the message itself. And I know there are people like that. And
Absolutely.
I'm excited to encounter them, whether somebody that I know or somebody that I'm introduced to at some point in the future.
That's great. Well, you've met some wonderful people just this last week, and
of course,
I'm hoping and praying that this wonderful show about an incredible female protagonist and a male protagonist, and I hope that all of this comes to fruition. And I would love to know if you have any closing thoughts that you would like to share with our audience about your show and your future.
That's a good question. Do I have any? I've talked a lot.
No, you did a great job. I'm really impressed. It's great.
No, thank you. I mean, what I will say is I have had the stage image lodged in my brain for almost 5 years now of the moment that Hannah jumps out of a plane. And it's staged in the show. It's, it's about 2/3 of the way through. And I feel sometimes like we are all, I'm not trying to make this into sort of like a faux poetic thing, but I feel like we're all kind of standing on a plane in the sky with the back open and looking out at the beauty, but also the terror, And I'm hopeful that experience of watching that on stage can have that same meaning that it has had for me, walking home at night, thinking about that specific moment over and over again, almost like compulsively in a certain sense. And I think that maybe more than anything else, I look forward to the profound moment when I get to see that specific moment on stage, both for me, but hopefully having the same impact for audiences as well.
Thank you, Toby. Toby Singer, everyone, composer of The Match. And we hope to see your production on a major stage somewhere in the near future. Thanks for joining us at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. It's my pleasure to be able to talk with you today, Toby.
Thanks.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.